Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Kevin Carmichael on challenges for the global economy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and also a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio to talk about some pressing global issue. And today we're very pleased to have my fellow Senior Fellow, Kevin Carmichael, who's a well-known journalist who is based now in Mumbai. Right. And has been covering economic issues for some time. We're going to talk today about the challenges for the global economy. And of course, we could talk about this for all day, all week, I think.
We could. It's and we have been for years, haven't we?
Many things we could be talking about. So let's do the greatest hits as you see them. From the position of the world in 2016, as we look forward to the next 5-10 years or so, what are some of the big issues that you think really jump out as in need of attention, in particular in need of attention from those of us who are interested in global governance?
Sure. Well, I think at the top of the list, hovering over everything, is China. Not sure what those of us outside of China can really do about that, other than watch closely and do our best to prod officials and thinkers there in at least what we assume to be the right direction. But really, you know, if there's much angst in the global economy right now, obviously that won't be a surprise to anyone who reads The Economist, the Financial Times, pays attention to what we write here. Obviously, if China was again growing at 8%, 9%, we wouldn't be having this discussion about stagnant, slowing global growth. So the reason I think that there is this degree of anxiety is people outside of China just don't understand what's going on in that country. I think if there was more confidence in the regime, there might be less worry about debt bubbles blowing up in our faces, be less angst about whether the government in Beijing is going to be able to transition from this sort of export-led growth model to a consumer-led growth model. The Chinese certainly just recently at the IMF meetings in Washington are trying to get the message out that, you know, don't worry, our growth is actually on target. We're making the changes that we need to make. Those of you who point fingers just don't really understand how it works in China. You know, and I guess people left that meeting somewhat reassured. So it suggests that's behind the scenes, perhaps the Chinese officials said enough to calm people down a little bit. The managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, talked about it being a good therapy session for everyone. So it seems that the Chinese maybe said the right things. But you know, we'll see how well that goes over in financial markets, where much of the tumult that we've been dealing with in 2016 is emanating from. For the moment, waters are calm, but you know, given how little understanding we have about what's going on in China, I suppose that could change at any moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, China is also an innovator when it comes to economic governance, and China has championed a rival to the Asian Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, aggressive One Belt, One Road policy, attempting to bring Chinese goods more easily to Western markets, vice versa, presumably. How much of the anxiety about China is just about numbers and growth, and how much is about the so-called challenge it poses to the existing international economic order?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to put the emphasis simply on growth. I think in the years before the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and certainly in the years right after, the world got pretty addicted to that double-digit growth, even though at every G20 meeting, every IMF meeting, there were at the same time worries about China growing too fast, and this, you know, lots of talk about how this is unsustainable, et cetera, et cetera. Yet Countries like Canada, certainly other emerging markets who are either dependent or who derive much of their export wealth from commodities, were certainly benefiting a great deal from that accelerated growth rate in China. And then lo and behold, the Chinese sort of do what they said they were going to do and did what everybody is going through the process that everyone said they needed to go through, and that is slow down, again, shift that economy from a export-led model to a consumption-led model. Yet the rest of the world wasn't ready to substitute for that growth that was lost. So, and now of course there's this extra pressure on China to avoid the worst. The onus seems to be, I guess I would think of it this way: for a long time, the onus was on the U.S. to drive the global economy. That's still true to an extent, but then now seems to be this extra onus on China to keep the global growth propped up and avoid any sort of disaster. So I mean, a lot is riding on what's going on in Beijing, in part because the rest of us aren't doing our part, perhaps.
Right. Now, the Chinese, of course, interpret the Trans-Pacific Partnership as an offensive attempting to keep China on its back foot economically, and that would seem to be at odds with the Western incentives to make sure that China has steady positive growth rates.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate China at some point signing up to the TPP?
I don't know. I mean, if you were China, would you sign up? I mean, the U.S. clearly has designed the TPP in its image to get ahead of China, to, I suppose, probably recognizing the fact that as soon as China enters the room, there's a negotiating partner with at least as much influence on the negotiations as Washington would have. So it's clearly tried to seize the initiative and get out ahead on this. I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. I mean, the first thing we're going to have to see, of course, is to get TPP approved in Washington itself. You see a certain amount of reluctance starting to sprout up in some of certainly the late signatories like Canada and Japan and Australia. There seems to be some grudging commitment to TPP, but I wouldn't say it's it's an enthusiastic commitment to TPP. So if Obama, before his presidency ends this year, fails to find a way to get this through with Congress, you could anticipate a near future where suddenly the whole TPP initiative sort of stalls. Right. And then maybe there's a movement generated to sort of shift back to the WTO and have more of a multilateral, like a proper multilateral approach to trade again. It might be wishful thinking on my part. That certainly would be my preference. But and then where does that leave China? I don't know. If I was China, I'd be sitting back and waiting to see what happens. And ultimately, do I want to join an agreement that is really so tilted to the U.S. advantage? Perhaps not.
Right. You mentioned commodities a moment ago, and commodities and the transition to a green global economy are very closely linked, especially for Canada, since we have so much at stake in the oil price. Do you see this as a major challenge going forward, or is this really an opportunity? And if you see it more as an opportunity, what should we be doing to think of it that way? We're clearly not quite thinking of it that way. And what would you suggest by way of policy change we do to kickstart this transition?
Right. I'm not sure if I have any specific ideas on policy other than, obviously we need to push forward and get to some form of a carbon price. What that looks like, I guess there's some debate. I prefer simpler rather than complicated. I think you need to do a couple of things. You need to you just need to tax it at the base level of consumption, I think, and then you need to find ways to make it less exciting to produce. So you need to find ways to make it more expensive at that end. And there's been some good work here at CIGI done on that. Mark Carney at the Bank of England is talking about how you need to ensure that that basically the risk of carbon production, if I can put it that way, is being assessed. And really what he's saying there, and what others that advocate that point of view are getting at, is that for years we've not priced in the risk adequately into the cost structure of pumping crude from the ground and whatnot. So if you do that, if you force these force carbon producers to make part of their or to work into their business plan or cost structures the fact that if we're going to lend you money, we're going to do so at a rate that recognizes that 10 years from now or 20 years from now, you could be on the hook for everything that's gone wrong with the planet and climate change. And I think that is another avenue at which obviously we need to attack this problem. But obviously, clearly, it's an opportunity. I think it's amazing to see sort of the world seem to have galvanized around the idea that it is suddenly more opportunity than cost, and given the things we've been discussing around the inadequacy of global growth at the moment, clearly the investment that's going to go into sort of reorienting the economy to a green economy from a carbon-based economy is it has to generate a certain amount of economic growth, which is the main problem that we're really trying to grapple with at the moment.
Now, you were at the IMF meeting recently. Was there a sense that the IMF coming out strongly in favor of carbon pricing is going to make a difference?
I think when the IMF is excellent at starting a discussion or setting a baseline for the discussion. So I think if you have the IMF pushing hard in this direction, it makes it more difficult for those who oppose a carbon price to run and hide. I mean, basically the IMF is not this is not Greenpeace. I mean, they're not or the Sierra Club or anything like that. They're not putting forward policy proposals that they believe are going to impoverish any of their members or anything like that. So this is pretty standard stuff, I think, once the IMF gets behind it. So it makes it more difficult to say the idea of a carbon price is harmful to economic growth or going to hurt jobs, et cetera.
Do you think we'll hear any talk anytime soon about carbon tariffs?
Carbon tariffs.
So far, so
yeah,
not
I
so
don't know.
much.
I mean, it's. I'm sure there's some people that would like to go there, and maybe it would even be a good idea. You see at the WTO, for example, the U.S. winning a suit against. I think it was Indian solar panels, and so that. I actually find that sort of thing troubling. You'd think that given the gravity of the climate change problem, we would just be seeking lowest cost solutions. Mm-hmm. But obviously, there's opportunity here for domestic self-interest, economic interest to force its way into the debate. So I guess if some major players like the U.S. are willing to go after countries who have found ways to produce solar panels fairly cheaply because some of their domestic producers are upset by it. I guess you could see an avenue in which carbon tariffs could suddenly present themselves, but I don't know that we're close to that yet.
Mm. Now, you're based in India now. India is an interesting microcosm of the future of the global economy,
yes,
I imagine. So that's a country that's got this full range of challenges. Economic growth is priced in just because of the demographics, but at the same time you have urbanization and pollution and the need also to do a transition to a green economy. How does a relatively poor country such as India tackle all of these challenges? And as India goes, so goes the global economy?
Well, I think there are a lot of people out there who wished it was as simple as that. If India could get its economy going, say at that double-digit rate that China achieved 2-3 decades back, and so India could sort of, the same moment that China is slowing down, India could sort of step in and take the baton, and we'd again have this great center for global demand that would lift commodity prices and that sort of thing. And certainly, I think there are lots of people in New Delhi, for example, who would also like to engineer such a switch. India's a complicated place, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure many people who have been there or read about it recognize. I don't see. I think there's a grudging acceptance that India is not, in fact, going to be the big growth engine that China was. It's a bright spot, sure. Its growth rates there are 7-8%. It's better than anybody else, but it remains a complicated place with lots of problems. And the state banks are burdened with non-performing assets and debt from previous attempts to keep up with China. The regulatory system remains difficult for anybody who wants to come there to try to invest. So, there's hope that India's going to help, but India's going to need a lot of help of its own to push the global economy forward.
Mm-hmm. So what does the world need by way of governance innovation, which is what we do here at CIGI?
Yes,
how are things looking in terms of the range of institutions and procedures available for tackling challenges?
Yeah, I guess my own observations of the last year or so have turned more negative. I think a lot of us were positive about the influence of the G20 coming out of the crisis. Saw the major players sort of galvanize around a problem and executed. It was heartening to observe, but that initiative has diminished, and I guess it's up to you to decide whether that's disappointing or just inevitable. Lots of people, of course, say that that the G20 is only really good at fighting fires, and until there's another one, it's just reasonable to think that self-interested countries are going to continue to do self-interested things. I would like to think that a group like that could recognize that we're, if not in a crisis, in a pretty difficult situation right now that demands a global response. For instance, around sort of a global investment program, or a recognition that given the decline in private investment, this is an opportunity for countries to work together to fill that gap until confidence returns, trade picks up, all of those sorts of things. You see a bit of that, but you don't actually see an aggressive push forward yet. So, it's not the best of days for global governance, I don't think.
Is this an opportunity for the G7 to reassert itself?
Well, I suppose, except that's the G7 is a microcosm of the ideological divide that's impeding any sort of progress on a lot of these issues right now, right? So, I think the IMF and certainly some of the other more powerful countries around the G20, like the U.S., for example, or in particular, would like to see a more aggressive global fiscal stimulus campaign. But So the G7, you would think that the U.S. could push that. Certainly Canada's on board, Japan's on board with that initiative, but then you have Germany and the U.K. who are aggressively opposed. Yeah, I don't think it's really an opportunity for the G7 to reassert itself. I suppose it's an argument for the G7 to continue meeting and remaining a distraction. But I think it would be more positive if the G7 sort of just asserted itself within the G20.
Right. Well, let's see what happens in that front in May in Tokyo, or in Shima at the summit. And thanks for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us. And to our audience, please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at CIGI Online on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Kevin Carmichael on challenges for the global economy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and also a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's our pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio to talk about some pressing global issue. And today we're very pleased to have my fellow Senior Fellow, Kevin Carmichael, who's a well-known journalist who is based now in Mumbai. Right. And has been covering economic issues for some time. We're going to talk today about the challenges for the global economy. And of course, we could talk about this for all day, all week, I think.
We could. Yeah, and we have been for years, haven't we?
Many things we could be talking about. So let's do the greatest hits as you see them. From the position of the world in 2016, as we look forward to the next 5-10 years or so, what are some of the big issues that you think really jump out as in need of attention, in particular in need of attention from those of us who are interested in global governance?
Sure. Well, I think at the top of the list, hovering over everything, is China. Not sure what those of us outside of China can really do about that, other than watch closely and do our best to prod officials and thinkers there in at least what we assume to be the right direction. But really, if there's much angst in the global economy right now, obviously that won't be a surprise to anyone who reads The Economist, the Financial Times, pays attention. It's going to be able to transition from this sort of export-led growth model to a consumer-led growth model. The Chinese certainly just recently at the IMF meetings in Washington are trying to get the message out that, don't worry, our growth is actually on target. We're making the changes that we need to make. Those of you who point fingers just don't really understand how it works in China. And I guess people left that meeting somewhat reassured, so it suggests that's behind the scenes, perhaps the Chinese officials said enough to calm people down a little bit, to what we write here. Obviously, if China was again growing at 8%, 9%, we wouldn't be having this discussion about stagnant, slowing global growth. So the reason I think that there is this degree of anxiety is people outside of China just don't understand what's going on in that country. I think if there was more confidence in the regime, there might be less worry about debt bubbles blowing up in our faces, be less angst about whether the government in Beijing